American Literature since 1945, as written by the Norton Anthology. The United States and World Power. After the Allies defeated Germany and Japan in World War II, the United States emerged as the only world power with a strong economy. The nation's participation in World War II had reorganized the American economy in ways that changed the lifestyles and expectations of its citizens. Women, and African Americans in particular, broadened their expectations of economic and social opportunities after their participation in the war effort. The United States exploded 2 atomic bombs in Japan in August 1945, the first and only atomic bombs that have ever been deployed. The effect was so horrific and catastrophic that the United States shifted to a policy of amassing military strength for deterrence rather than combat. This strategy was known as Cold War. America's Cold War was directed at containing the political, economic, military, and ideological influence of communism around the globe. The Soviet Union, and eventually China, emerged as the main Cold War adversaries of the United States. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, social critics perceived a stable conformity to American life, as well as a dedication to an increasingly materialistic standard of living enabled by the strong economy and by the abundance of job opportunities. American life became increasingly mobile as the population began a westward shift and more people relied on automobiles. The interstate highway system was begun in 1955. Conflicts within and resistance to this way of life, purportedly based on stability and conformity, emerged in the 1960s, or the 60s, as this period is known. This tumultuous period of American history, beginning with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, was characterized by its countercultural revolt against the status quo. The 60s ushered in a combative period in civil rights, climaxing with the most sustained and effective attempts to remedy the evils of racial discrimination since Reconstruction. Women began to organize in the 60s to pursue their legal, ethical, and cultural interests, a position now defined as feminism. Active dissension within the culture emerged in response to military involvement in Vietnam. The nation was shocked in 1974 by the Watergate scandal, a revelation of President Richard Nixon's abuses of governmental privileges that led to his resignation. By the end of the 1970s, some characteristics that had seemed countercultural in the 60s had been accepted in mainstream American culture, including informalities of dress, relaxation of social codes, and an increased respect for individual rights. The 1980s witnessed a call for a return to traditional values, interpreted as a return not to community and self-sacrifice, but to the pursuit of wealth. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, income disparities grew while taxes fell, and Americans began to focus on personal acquisition. The economy boomed, but shifted away from manufacturing and into service and financial speculation. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 after American economic might had depleted its ability to compete. The attack on New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon by terrorists on September 11, 2001, shifted the nation's political agenda to a seemingly open-ended conflict with revolutionary Islamic forces. Talking point 2. Literary developments. The ideal of homogeneity and conformity, so prominent in the 1950s and early 1960s, led many writers to aspire to the creation of a single work, short story, novel, poem, or play, that could represent the experiences of an entire people and that could attempt to represent a common national essence that lay beneath distinctions of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, or region. Novelists hoped to write the so-called Great American Novel that would characterize the larger aspects of the national experience. Playwrights, too, aspired to write plays that would be nationally representative, embracing otherwise mundane characters as universal types that could speak to monumental national issues. In the 1950s and 60s, poets acquired a new visibility in American life through writers' conferences and workshops, recordings, and published and broadcast interviews and readings. Despite this increase in poetry's visibility, its relatively marginal position in the nation's culture, when compared to that of prose fiction, may have allowed it more diversity from the idea or ideal of homogeneity. In the 1950s, the poetic standard was a short lyric meditation on an object, landscape, or observed encounter that clarified or epitomized a feeling. The period also supported poets who gave voice to previously marginalized social groups and poets who experimented with new rhythms. The notion that any single piece of literature could represent an entire people or nation fell out of favor in the 60s, as the nation itself fractured over such issues as the uses of industrial and military power. The institutions of marriage and the family, the rights of racial minorities, women and homosexuals, the use of drugs and alternative states of consciousness. Some writers felt that social reality had become too unstable to serve as a reliable anchor for their narratives, and some critics believed that fiction, and particularly the novel, was dead, having exhausted its formal possibilities. Poetry was transformed by the appearance of two poems in the late 1950s, Allen Ginsberg's Howl, 1956, with its anti-establishment message, open, experimental form, and strong oral emphasis, and Robert Lowell's Life Studies, 1959, with its directness and autobiographical intensity. Technological advances such as the advent of television and air travel challenged boundaries of time and space and brought a global awareness that made the concept of all-encompassing expressions of the world through literature seem impossible. Confessional poetry and literature in the 1960s, pieces that involved autobiographical revelations about difficult personal subject matter, such as sex, divorce, alcoholism, and insanity, began to focus on the distinctness of individual experience, not its representativeness. Deconstruction, a literary theory first developed by French linguists and philosophers, questions assumptions about the stability of language, the ability of words to represent reality, and the extent to which facts might be constructed by intellectual operations. The idea of literature as a form of self-expression was complicated by deconstructionist skepticism about the very idea of a coherent or essential self. The political dissent of the 1960s opened up spaces for a range of voices in literature representing, in the new and varied ways, the experiences and views of African Americans, Southerners, Jews, feminists, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and others. This development produced a rich legacy in American literature. The contemporary literary period values heterogeneity in its form and pluralism in its cultural influences. Contemporary literature is also increasingly preoccupied with questions about what constitutes artificiality and what constitutes authenticity. Or creative nonfiction reflects contemporary literature's impatience with the opposition between fact and fiction, combining aspects of the essay, memoir, reportage, criticism, and autobiography, creative nonfiction uses the techniques of fiction to make a claim to the real. The internet has produced a contemporary literary culture that is keenly aware that reality is hybrid, with constant input from multiple sources. Contemporary literature reflects this insight with its proclivity for combining, editing, altering, and rearranging existing materials. American literature since 1945, timeline connections as written by the Norton Anthology. 1945, the U.S. drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrenders, ending World War II. Cold War begins. 1947, Jackie Robinson becomes the first black major league ball player. 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy begins attacks on communism. 1950 to 1953, the Korean War. 1953, House Concurrent Resolution 108 dictates government's intention to terminate its treaty relations with the Native American tribes. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education declares segregated schools unconstitutional. Beat Generation poets begin to gather at San Francisco's City Lights bookshop. 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. leads bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. 1959, Fidel Castro becomes communist leader of Cuba. 1960, Woolworth lunch counter sit-in at Greensboro, North Carolina, marks the beginning of civil rights movement. 1962, the United States and Soviet Union close to war over Russian missiles based in Cuba. Missiles are withdrawn. 1963, King delivers I Have a Dream speech. Black church in Birmingham, Alabama is bombed, killing 4 girls. President John F. Kennedy is assassinated. 1965, riots break out in Watts section of Los Angeles. Malcolm X is assassinated. The hippie culture flourishes in San Francisco. 1965 to 1973, the Vietnam War era. 1966, National Organization for Women, NOW, founded. Hayden and Brooks criticized at Black Writers Conference, Fisk University, for composing academic poetry. 1968, King is assassinated. Senator Robert F. Kennedy is also assassinated. Photo of Earthrise by Apollo 8. 1969, U.S. astronauts land on the moon. Stonewall riots in New York City initiate gay liberation movement. Woodstock Festival held near Bethel, New York. 1970, National Guard kills 4 students during anti-war demonstration at Kent State University, Ohio. 1972, Watergate scandal. Military draft ends. 1973, Roe v. Wade legalizes abortion. American Indian Movement members occupy Wounded Knee, South Dakota. 1974, President Richard Nixon resigns in wake of Watergate, avoiding impeachment. 1976, the U.S. bicentennial. 1982, Equal Rights Amendment is defeated. Anti-nuclear movement protests manufacture of nuclear weapons. AIDS officially identified in the United States. 1989, Soviet Union collapses. The Cold War ends. Oil tanker Exxon Valdez runs aground in Alaska. 1990, Congress passes Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. 1991, the United States enters the Persian Gulf War. World Wide Web is introduced. 1995, federal building in Oklahoma City bombed in a terrorist attack. 1997, Pathfinder robot explores Mars. 2001, execution of Timothy McVeigh, convicted of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. September 11, terrorist attacks on Pentagon and World Trade Center. 2003, United States and the Great Britain invade Iraq. 2007, advent of worst economic recession since the Great Depression. 2009, inauguration of Barack Obama as U.S. President. 2010, massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. 2011, death of terrorist leader Osama bin Laden, architect of the 9/11 attacks.